For nearly 600 years, a single empire was almost constantly at war. It clashed with kings and sultans, republics and crusaders, rebels and rising European states. Territories were gained and lost. Borders were redrawn again and again. Crises came and went, and armies marched from the Balkans deep into the Arabian deserts. Yet through all of this, the empire accomplished something extraordinarily rare in history. It didn't financially collapse under the weight of its wars. That's because the Ottoman Empire didn't simply fight wars. It mastered the art of paying for them, over and over, without running out of money. Money, power, and the past intersect, and where simple explanations never tell the whole story. The Ottoman state existed from roughly 1299 until 1922. That's longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the British Empire, and longer than most political entities people usually think of as great empires. But survival alone isn't the real puzzle. The real question is how a state that was almost perpetually at war avoided being crushed by the financial burden. In Western popular thinking, empires fall because they lose battles, but battles themselves don't bankrupt countries. Budgets do, poor leadership does, logistics do. The Ottomans understood this very early on. Instead of copying the tax and army models used by European kingdoms, they built something fundamentally different, a system designed so that warfare could largely sustain itself. Before we examine how that system worked, we need to be clear about what the Ottoman Empire actually was. For many Western audiences, it exists mostly as imagery: sultans, turbans, domes, and elite Janissary soldiers. Those visuals are familiar. The institutional machine that powered them for centuries is not. So let's slow down and set the foundation. The Ottomans began as a small frontier state in northwestern Anatolia, led by Osman I, a local war leader, commanding a few thousand horsemen, but blessed with exceptional timing. As Byzantine authority weakened and Mongol influence faded from the region, Osman and his followers found themselves perfectly positioned to expand. Their early conquests weren't just military victories. They were immediate financial gains. Each new territory meant farmland, resources, tax revenue, and new populations under Ottoman control. This leads to the first crucial insight about Ottoman finances. From the very beginning, war wasn't an expense. It was a source of income. By the time the Ottomans captured Bursa in 1326 and later moved into Europe, during the mid-14th century, they were no longer a marginal frontier power. They now controlled key trade corridors linking Europe and Asia. And in a medieval economy, that was equivalent to controlling the world's main arteries. Merchants traveling from Venice to Persia, from Cairo to Budapest, from Baghdad to Istanbul, all passed through Ottoman lands, and every passage meant tolls, fees, and taxes. This mattered because warfare depends on three essentials: food, materials, and manpower. The Ottomans didn't necessarily possess more of these than their rivals, but they had something even more decisive: steady cash flow. Their territory sat at the heart of the wealthiest commercial network of the pre-modern world. Silk, spices, textiles, horses, weapons, timber, sugar, copper, nearly everything moved through Ottoman space, and every movement generated revenue. Still, a strong income base alone can't explain how the empire funded campaigns that stretched from the walls of Vienna to the mountains of Yemen. Many empires had wealth. Most still collapsed under military costs. What set the Ottomans apart was structure. They deliberately engineered a system that made the army largely self-financing. This is where the story shifts away from geography and toward institutional design, and toward one of the most important, yet often misunderstood, Ottoman innovations: the timar system. At its core, the system addressed the most expensive problem any state faces: paying its soldiers. Modern governments spend enormous sums on professional armies, wages, equipment, animals, benefits, and pensions. The Ottomans took a radically different approach. Instead of paying soldiers in cash, they paid them in authority. A timar was, essentially, a revenue district. A soldier, typically a cavalryman, known as a sepahi, was granted the right to collect taxes from a specific area. In return, he was required to arm himself, maintain his horse, and report for military campaigns. Fully equipped, there was no salary. The soldier financed himself. This arrangement was a masterpiece of financial design. The state lowered its direct expenses. Soldiers had a vested interest in maintaining local stability, since productive villages meant reliable income. Peasants lived under a predictable local authority, and the empire gained a large, mobile army without draining the central treasury. Imagine a modern government compensating soldiers not with paychecks, but with the right to tax an entire county. It sounds risky, and it was, but in the 14th and 15th centuries, it worked remarkably well. It transformed the Ottoman military into a tax-driven war machine. More importantly, it made Ottoman warfare cheap. European rulers relied on costly knights or mercenaries who demanded immediate payment. When a king's money ran out, his army's loyalty vanished with it. The Ottomans avoided this trap. Their soldiers' income continued even in peacetime. War didn't break the system, it activated it. But the timar system wasn't the only reason the Ottomans could afford centuries of conflict. There was another institution, one familiar by name to Western audiences, but rarely understood in financial terms. The Janissaries. Their method of funding was a critical pillar of the Ottoman war economy. And to understand that, the story must shift once again from tax-supported cavalry to salaried infantry funded through a far more controversial system. To grasp the second pillar of the Ottoman war funding system, we need to turn to the Janissaries, an elite infantry force feared by outsiders, resented by Christian populations, and trusted by sultans more than their own relatives. They were professional soldiers in the truest sense, highly disciplined, trained from childhood, and loyal only to the state. By medieval European standards, they were as close as the era came to a standing Marine Corps. What made the Janissaries truly distinctive, however, was not just how they fought, but how they were recruited and paid. Their ranks were filled through the devshirme, often described as the child levy. In Christian communities across the Balkans, boys were selected, taken from their families, converted to Islam, and educated within the empire's military institutions. There, they were trained and shaped into soldiers whose entire identity and future depended on the state itself, not on clans, landowners, or local loyalties. The moral implications of this system aren't the focus here. It was undeniably coercive, and it shouldn't be romanticized. But from a financial perspective, it achieved something no other empire had managed. The state acquired elite, fully trained soldiers without bearing the enormous upfront cost of raising, feeding, and educating children from birth. While the Ottomans invested heavily in the Janissaries' training, the economic burden of raising those children to adulthood had already been absorbed by conquered populations. The result was a military force that entered service without the lifetime developmental costs that could cripple a treasury. Once enlisted, Janissaries received regular pay and housing, but for much of their early history, they were forbidden from marrying or engaging in private business. This minimized conflicts of interest and kept their loyalty firmly tied to the central state. If the timar system transformed cavalry into a self-funded force, the Janissaries turned infantry into a disciplined professional corps that was remarkably cost-effective. Together, these two institutions formed a military structure that saved the empire immense sums over the centuries. But the Ottomans went further. They refined an even more powerful principle, making conquest pay for future conquest. Each new territory brought more than land. It delivered new taxpayers, additional timars, fresh trade corridors, ports, and streams of revenue. Every successful campaign strengthened the financial base for the next one. While European kingdoms often emerged from wars poorer than before, the Ottomans frequently returned wealthier. This wasn't luck or tactical brilliance alone. It was cash flow. Geography played a decisive role. The Ottoman Empire controlled the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, dominated the eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and sat astride the caravan routes linking Persia and Central Asia. Anyone moving goods between Europe and Asia passed through Ottoman hands and paid for the privilege. Silk from China, spices from India, Persian carpets, all were taxed. Venetian traders, Arab merchants, Balkan caravans, North African fleets states all moved through the empire's economic checkpoint. By the 16th century, this system had turned the Ottoman state into one of the richest powers on earth. War was costly, but commerce was even more profitable, and the empire built institutions specifically designed to capture that wealth. One such tool was the use of state monopolies. Essential goods, including salt, tobacco, coffee, and at times soap, were placed under direct government control. Because these products were part of everyday life, they generated steady, predictable income. This begins to sound strikingly modern, because state monopolies are the predecessors of today's strategic industries. Oil in Saudi Arabia, gas pipelines in Russia, the Suez Canal in Egypt. Every empire depends on a reliable revenue anchor. And for the Ottomans, monopolies filled that role. Another mechanism was tribute and indirect rule. Regions such as Crimea and Wallachia paid annual sums to the Ottoman treasury in exchange for protection or a degree of autonomy. Accepting tribute was often cheaper than governing directly, and the funds supported armies, infrastructure, fortifications, and naval forces, the most impressive and ultimately fragile aspect of the Ottoman financial system was how long it postponed the need for borrowing. For centuries, the empire largely lived within its means. Wars were funded through land, grants, trade taxes, tribute, monopolies, and plunder. There was no massive national debt, no bond markets siphoning off revenue, and no foreign creditors shaping imperial policy. Eventually, that balance broke. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the global landscape shifted. European states industrialized. Their militaries adopted new technologies. Trade increasingly moved across oceans rather than through overland Ottoman routes. The empire could no longer rely on caravans and tolls to sustain its military machine. At the same time, the timar system deteriorated. Local tax holders abused their authority. Central oversight weakened, and military reliability declined. The Janissaries also changed. Over generations, they accumulated wealth, privileges, and political influence, becoming a state within the state. Their independence made reform nearly impossible. They resisted modernization, consumed growing portions of the treasury, and became a major barrier to change. When the empire finally attempted to build European-style armies, it needed something it had avoided for centuries: large cash salaries. To pay for them, it turned to something even riskier: foreign borrowing. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire took on heavy loans from European banks at high interest rates. The same powers it had once outmaneuvered now held its financial leash. Debt mounted. Payments fell behind. And in 1881, the empire was forced to surrender control of its finances to an international commission, dominated by France and Britain, marking a humiliating end to centuries of fiscal independence. It's a pattern we've seen again and again. A great power rises on tight financial discipline, holds itself together through clever institutional design, ignores the early warning signs, and finally unravels when the economics stop adding up. And that brings us to the present. If the Ottoman system sounds like something distant and outdated, take a closer look. The same ideas are still with us. They've just been repackaged for the modern world. What the timar system once did, governments now accomplish through contractors and privatized logistics. Modern states outsource massive portions of military operations to private firms, cutting down on permanent payroll costs in much the same way the Ottomans once did. Trade tolls haven't disappeared either. Today, they show up as struggles over shipping lanes, canals, and energy corridors. From the Strait of Hormuz to the South China Sea, whoever controls the choke points controls the flow of money moving through them. State monopolies are still very much alive, operating through national oil companies and sovereign wealth funds. Saudi Aramco plays a role similar to the Ottoman salt monopoly, except the scale has grown from millions to trillions. Even the idea of conquest funding conquest hasn't vanished. It survives in resource-driven conflicts, where territory and influence are pursued not for prestige, but for oil, gas, minerals, pipelines, and strategic positioning. And the final Ottoman mistake, turning to heavy borrowing late in the game, has clear modern echoes. National debt crises follow the same script. Governments finance deficits with loans until the structure cracks. Argentina, Greece, and even today's debates surrounding U.S. debt all rhyme with this pattern. The financial logic of empire doesn't change Only the uniforms do. So what's the takeaway? Empires rarely fall because they lose a decisive battle. They fall because their finances collapse. The Ottomans endured for 6 centuries because their system was disciplined, efficient, and carefully designed to turn war into income. They declined when that system failed, when expansion no longer paid for itself, when global trade routes bypassed their lands, when armies became too costly, and when debt handed control of the future to foreign creditors. That's the deeper warning embedded in their story. Financial systems can uphold power for hundreds of years until the moment they stop working. History may not repeat itself, but if you fail to understand it, it has a way of crushing you anyway. If this changed how you see the past, consider subscribing. History holds the answers, and I'll help you find them.